In 1954, I lived in Hollywood. I knew many of the stars and directors, and one of them was a man by the name of Nicholas Ray. Nick invited me to a soiree. He had them every Sunday at the Chateau Montmartre Hotel. At this party, I met James Dean. At the end of the conversation, Jimmy said to me, I've got a new movie coming out, and it's being screened in Santa Monica. It's a sneak preview. Take a look at it. And it was East of Eden. Well, I was knocked out. I came out of the theater, and in an alleyway next to the theater was Jimmy sitting on his motorcycle. And of course, I started telling him how extraordinary I thought his acting was. I concluded that I wanted to use him as the model, the symbol of the new movement of actors in Hollywood.
Time, yeah. James Dean was one of his like 3 big films. We method actors of all time.
Yes.
My mother knows James Dean.
I love Alex.
Young when he died, he was very, very before. He could have been like Marlon Brando, like any of those greats, Al Pacino.
I think of him as like kind of like almost
changed the entire way we look at modern acting.
True.
Without a cause. He did. Yeah, because I mean, he was this new face. No one really knew who he was, and as you look back on his stuff, he's better than most actors we see today even. I mean, like his style, just the visceral acting he brought in, it really changed everything. And then Giant, I mean, that just showed a ton of his range, that piece. I never saw East of Eden, but yeah.
Made films not just for 1956, but he used to say, if we spend some time on this and take some care with this, this might be a film that people will be interested in 25 years from now.
That's how we became friends. He was, from that time forward, a constant guest, sometimes invited, sometimes not, but always welcome. I can't tell you whether he came to see my husband or me. Yes, I can. He liked us, but he loved our cat, Louis. And we came to recognize that he was Louis's guest. Louis was a generous host. He let Jimmy sit on his throne. The throne was, and still is, an 18th century Venetian chair, scarred and stained by the many indiscretions of cats and dogs. Created for an aristocrat in brocade and lace, the delicate chair seemed to be outraged by the intrusion of Jimmy's long blue-jeaned legs. It was there in an awkward position, the chair creaking perilously under him, that he would fall asleep with Louis on his lap, and the two of them dreamed together. Jimmy dreamed perhaps of Fairmont, Indiana, and the farm that he loved, or the vague shadow of a mother who was taken from him early in life. Or he may have, in his recurrent fantasy of walking down the Boulevard Saint-Germain, the street he knew only from photographs. It was a dream that was never to come true. Too often James Dean has been described as a meteor, a crazy, mixed-up kid, a Great Dane puppy, and a poet. He was all of these, and at the same time, none. His laugh was a half-silent chuckle, as though exuberance embarrassed him. His enthusiasms ran through the spectrum of human interests: motorcycles, jazz, bullfighting, apple pie, plum preserves, cats, and serious music. I knew little of his personal life. He was the least self-revealing being I ever met. But he has the austere good sense of a Quaker and the defense mechanisms of a turtle. His carapace was his own private world, a world of Schoenberg and Bartok, the primitive African beat, racing cars, and the writers he had recently discovered: Sartre, Genet, Malaparte, Saint-Exupéry, and Oscar Wilde. James Dean crossed our threshold for the first time in early spring of 1955. My husband, Sanford Roth, often compared his historic meeting with Jimmy as an encounter between two cats, each looking at the other over the rims of their eyeglasses, ears twitching with anxiety, dread, suspicion, and distrust, followed by a casual licking of a paw. This If there were any doubts, they were dissipated quickly, for Sandy was born under the sign of Leo, Jimmy under Aquarius, fire and water, astrologically compatible. Besides, they liked each other. That evening, he sat at our dinner table, sullen, unfriendly, withdrawn, casting myopic glances at the chicken curry and the chutney I was serving. For someone whose palate was attuned to chili and hamburgers and pizza and tacos, chicken curry must have seemed highly exotic. But the chutney was not. I was amazed to hear him comment that it tasted just like his aunt's plum preserves on the farm in Indiana. Plums are rather old-fashioned fruit and have scarcely any admirers left. Still, I dote on them, and so did James Dean. I never was sure whether his interest in them was intellectual pretense or really valid, but he did renounce Edgar Guest in their favor. It may have been through his constant exposure to our eclectic tastes and the world that we represented, or he may have been an embryo intellectual in the first stages of development. Then there was the generation gap, but the year was 1955, and people under 30 still trusted people over 30. Nevertheless, the gap, which may have been an uncrossable void, was solidly spanned by the abhorrence that my husband and I had of the common middle-place standards of our generation.
Now, what's the action here?
In the sequence we're going to shoot today, Jimmy Dean and his friend Plato, played by Sal Manale, are cornered by a high school gang up here in the planetarium parking lot.
I see, and Jimmy gets pushed around. This scene's a little more complicated. And it gets a more complicated treatment. Different angles, different setups. And the day grows, the light changes. Suddenly, it's high noon. And speaking of movie magic, presto. It moves right on into the afternoon, racing toward evening. Even at 2:45, shadows begin to form. When you're working in CinemaScope and Warner Color, the sun needs help. And shot by shot, the big scene of the day is put on film. A knife fight played against the backdrop of the city far below. Another viewpoint. Perhaps a close-up of one of the boys. Perhaps a sudden glimpse of a flashing hand, a smile, a lunge. The scene is a challenge, a duel, a dance between two boys in rebellion against the world. The film must tell it all. And as the day marches on, the lines in the typewritten page slowly grow and multiply. The question is, what makes kids from nice homes do things like this?
Hit your line!
The spotlight's faded.
Do you have any special advice for the young people who drive?
Take it easy driving. The life you might save might be mine.
September 30th, 1955, James Dean was driving his Porsche 550 Spider to a rally in Salinas, California. Originally, he was going to tow this car, but at the last minute, he decided to drive.
I suppose, by contrast to those other adults he had met, a visual lesson in bravado, the antithesis of those who chose passive resistance, who lived in small episodes rather than face insecurity and the inevitable threat of death. We were not the ideal parent image for Jimmy, as some of the biographers insist. We were, in fact, his contemporaries, even sharing that dogma which is the birthright of youth, which states that living means dying. Now, as I listen to the miraculous Mandarin of Bartok work, he wanted me to love as he did, I remember that terrible day of September 30th, 1955, which ended my short friendship with James Dean.
My mom tells me that he was a real rebel, like a huge movie star way back when, before he was born. And that's all I know. I watched some of his movies. I don't know what they were called when I was younger. I know he was a big inspiration for a lot of actors to do a lot of rebellious roles, and I think that's really great. But that's all I really know about him.
He's coming up to go to a race with some of his friends to race his Porsche sports car, and he stopped over in Bakersfield, filled up with gas, and when he got to this junction down here, I'm not sure who failed the right-of-way, but he or the other person, somehow they both collided and he was killed. It's about a half a mile from where we're sitting now.
23-year-old Donald Turnipseed, the driver of the Ford Tudor, had been traveling east on Highway 466 and was attempting to make a left turn onto Highway 41. Unfortunately, Turnipseed had already started to make his turn when he saw the Porsche traveling quickly close. Without time to turn, the two cars smashed nearly head-on. Dean, only 24, pinned inside, his broken neck broken. Donald Turnipseed, the driver of the other car, suffered only relatively little.
I never meant to lie. So this is goodbye. This is goodbye.
People are flocking up here to see this memorial. And, obviously it was a tragedy. I was on the phone just now with my mom, and she said she remembered the day he died. She was a young girl. And, that was one of her idols, matinee idols. And, boy, she remembered how big of a deal it was. It's, hey, we all die, but like I said, man, this guy's name is going to go down in history.
The shell of the Dean car was being transported to a road safety exhibition in Salinas when the truck skidded and crashed. Car designer George Barrett bought the car and planned to sell it for parts. When the car was delivered to his yard, it rolled back off the truck and broke a mechanic's leg. Troy McHenry, a Beverly Hills doctor, bought the Dean's engine and used it to replace the engine in his Porsche. The doctor was killed in a crash the first time he took the car out. Another unnamed doctor bought the Dean's transmission. He too was literally seriously injured in a car crash. An unnamed New Yorker bought two of the Dean's tires. His car crashed when both tires mysteriously blew out at the same time. Stolen from the scene of that fatal accident was the shell of James Dean's car. It's never been recovered.
The crowd is gone. My guitar's packed, and I'm leaving here.
It was a highly concentrated relationship, concise and abridged. All essentials were omitted, especially social amenities. I refused to be sentimental. I despise public memorials, but I cannot deny the fact that James Dean became a legend, a 20th century Billy Budd. His legend began, as all myths do, with the grassroots movement stemming from the naive refusal to accept the death of any hero as a finality. And so James Dean, now considered part human mortal and part divine god, was immortalized to a point just below canonization. The doubt of this hero's death was expanded into the belief that he is not dead at all, but alive, disfigured, unrecognizable, lying helpless in a Sumerium somewhere in the Argentine. Or is it in Bulgaria? Or that Lemesserie on the slopes of the Himalayas? James Dean cultists sometimes reach the pinnacle of caricature. Like the two young women, members of a sect calling themselves the Widows of James Dean, who wrote to me from Berlin, asking to be allowed to visit my house to talk about him and sit in his chair. Overwhelmed by curiosity, I agreed. They arrived a few weeks later, dressed in unrelieved black, wearing wedding rings engaged with JBD on their right hands, signifying the state of widowhood. They were in their early 20s, victims of post-war traumas, recipients of a national guilt, and only school children during James Dean's career. My first reaction to them was outrage. Later it turned to compassion. I could almost hear Jimmy say, "They are spooky, they're sick in the head." And they were very sick in the head, for they kneeled in front of that Venetian chair incanting a petition. They were performing in a black mass, a synthetic horizon, a ridiculous charade, and I was the sexton of this weird chapel. Quelle tristesse. Phenomena or not, James Dean became the adolescent's mythological hero. Here was the representation of all the loneliness, the frustrations and fears of youth. Chronologically, James Dean had long passed the age of adolescence. He was 24 when he died. But this screen image created a symbol for the real adolescents, a prototype which made it easier for them to rationalize their own misunderstood behavior. Again, the adolescents chose to show their attitude towards society by emulating his mode of dress: blue jeans, leather jacket, unbuttoned shirts and boots. The costume became the slogan, even the weapon for a mass resistance against bureaucratic conventions of the adult world. May I say that James Dean wore these clothes because he liked them and he knew he looked well in them? There was no social significance to this choice at all. Perhaps the most perfect analysis of the struggle of the human child to assert himself as he breaks through the shell of his babyhood was contained in an article in the Paris publication, Arts. In James Dean, today's youth discovers itself, less for the reasons usually advanced: violence, sadism, hysteria. More simply and commonplace, the modesty of feeling, continual fantasy life, pessimism, cruelty, moral purity without relation to everyday morality, but the more rigorous, the eternal adolescent love of tests and trials, intoxication, pride and regret at the feeling of oneself outside of society, refusal and desire to become integrated, and finally, acceptance of refusal of the world as it is.
The nominees for Best Actor are Ernest Borgnine in Marty, James Cagney in Love Me or Leave Me, James Dean in East of Eden,